It's distracting. Like,
No. Just more of the, in the past, like it ends up being like 5 minutes, and then all of a sudden, like
I can check that.
No, that was because I did it on my phone. So, are you okay with being in it? Okay.
Let me just make sure it doesn't shut off since you mentioned it.
I probably should
Find
have
out,
been in
you're
it.
gonna find out you're going modern something.
I'd rather we keep it open if he doesn't mind. So
Yeah, no. I just want to make sure it doesn't shut off.
Okay.
Word spread really fast.
So the display will stay on.
I know, right? So crazy.
Doesn't matter anymore. Once you're married, you do it.
I do whatever I want either way.
That's a Pesach. That's.
By the way, that's my mother told me that all the time. By the way, when I would argue with her, I'm like, I want to do it on the bed. She's like, everyone, leave me alone.
No, I already do whatever I want. I just do it slowly. Like I'm easing them into it.
Yeah.
And the voice thing is working, or no? Yeah, it's like
You have to
I will
speak up.
ask them.
Yeah, I'll speak up.
If there's any problem.
Unless you want to stand over there.
Whatever
Bobby
you want.
says hi, Usher.
Should I go slightly closer?
It would be better if you were closer. So I'm just
Oh,
standing
you
here.
got a chair away? Like that.
Well, that would make sense.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, is that better?
Yep.
All right.
There you go.
All right. Should I start?
Yep.
Okay. So, I'm trying to remember what's the name? I don't remember the name of
Your
it.
path to achieve freedom.
Using your past to achieve freedom. So, of course, often when I come up with an idea for a shir, I come up with a name, and then I sort of have to figure out, like, well, what is it that I actually want to say? So, I think it's going to be a little bit using your past to achieve freedom, but I think it's really going to be just using yourself to achieve freedom. I think that's actually probably much more accurate title. But so, I want to start off. One of my Rabbeim wrote a couple of books, and one of them, there's a quote from Alice in Wonderland, which I've never actually read yet. I feel like I should, because I quote this one scene like 8,000 times. And so eventually, I mean, I own it, I bought it, but I just haven't read it yet. So Alice in Wonderland basically is a story of this girl, and she ends up going down this rabbit hole, and she ends up in this very strange world, and she's trying to get back to where she's from. So in the book, right, she's lost, and she meets all these really weird characters, and it's kind of, it's an interesting story. And at one point, she meets up with this cat, the Cheshire cat, and the Cheshire cat is this big smile, and sometimes the cat disappears and all that stuff to the smile. I don't remember too much more about it, but Alice is lost, and she comes to the Cheshire cat, and she says, can you help me? I'm lost. And he says, well, where is it that you want to go? And she says, I don't know. And he says, well, in that case, it doesn't make a difference which way you go. Right? So I always use this. I mean, I think it's an important idea that, you have to always know where your destination is in order to be able to get there. Right? I mean, the Ramchal talks about this without mentioning Alice in Wonderland. I think he lived a little bit before then. But it says that, it says that if you don't know where you're trying to go, then even if you reach your destination, you won't know it. So you have to have a sense of where you're going. So if you think about it, the goal of the Pesach Seder, right? It's right there. It's Chayav Adam L'Rosas Atzmo. If you're Sephardi, you might say Chayav Adam Laharos it's Atzmo, but person has to see themselves K'iluhu Yatzam Mitzrayim, as if they go out of Egypt. Right? Sephardi, I think also Al Pi the Rambam adding the word Ata with an ayin, like as if you're going out now. And of course, this is like a very, very difficult. It's very easy to say, like you have to see yourself as if you're going out. But it's difficult. I mean, how do you get there? I mean, and it's conceptually, it's very weird. I mean, if you think about it, like there's no other holiday where we ask you to imagine you're going through that experience at that point, right? In other words, we don't say to you on Purim, like you have an obligation to see yourself as if Haman is going to destroy you and then you're saved, right? We don't try to do, I mean, what's going on over here? Like, why is that? Why is that the goal? And second of all, and hopefully we're gonna try to, I'm gonna try to answer all these questions eventually, hopefully. And second of all, I mean, what does it even mean? Like, why should we see ourselves as if we're slaves? I mean, we're not really slaves, are we? I mean, in what sense? We're living, over 3,000 years later. Thank God, we don't have any real sense personally of what slavery is like. So what's the benefit of seeing ourselves as if we're slaves? Also, if you think about it, right, everybody always knows, like in English, right, they always say, let my people go, right? That Moshe comes to Paro and he says, let my people go, right? But of course, that's only like a partial quote. He really says, Shlach et ami, send out my nation, via avduni, so they will serve me, referring to God, right? So, I always point out, it's kind of strange. Like people think of Pesach, especially like in the secular world, as like the holiday of freedom. But if you think about it, what God is really saying is like, they should, let them go from your slavery so that they could serve me, right? And can you imagine like a celebration for a day where someone who is a slave gets traded, to another slave master? Even if you're going to say, oh, but the new slave master is much nicer, but still, like, okay, like it's better, but like, what exactly? We're not really, celebrating freedom. We're actually celebrating just a different type of slavery. And then finally, the third question is, we're thanking God, we're praising God for taking us out, but there's of course the fact that we ignore that He put us there in the first place, right? So like, what exactly, are we being thankful for, right? In other words, like, so these are three questions. So not the four questions, it's not yet Pesach, so I want to start off with these three questions, and then hopefully I'm going to go someplace. Hopefully I'll go someplace with that. So there's an idea within a lot of Hasidic thought that really, my whole first question of what do you mean, that we have to see ourselves as slaves is not just for pretend, but in fact we really are slaves, right? Which of course sounds like a strange thing because, we certainly don't have any of the trappings of slaves. But what I think it's getting at, again, like you can find this in a lot of different places. It's sort of, I'll give you an example. I used to, I'm still somewhat of a sports fan. I don't know, it just doesn't engage me as much as it used to. But I used to be like, when I was a kid, I was like a junkie. I just like, I love going to games, and I read about it, and I memorized all these stats, and I collected baseball cards, all this stuff. And one of the things that's very interesting is that up until the early '60s, if you read a book about, written by baseball players, if they ever actually write their autobiographies, but Ki'ilu, written by a baseball player, was that it was all made up. They made it sound like, after the game, they went out and they got milk and cookies and they talked and then they went home to their families. It was like a very rated G version of what's going on. And in truth, even going back a long, long ways without getting into any specific details, they were living pretty rowdy lives. And in the early '60s, there was a pitcher, not a particularly good pitcher, but by the name of Jim Bowden, who decided that he was going, well, actually, probably I think it was maybe late '60s, he decided he was going to write an autobiography. And for the first time, this autobiography, he was going to be very, very open about what went on. And it was, as you can imagine, it was actually kind of, very controversial all over. Major League Baseball was mad at him, again, he was ruining this image of the players as being very wholesome. The players were mad at him because, and again, without getting into the details, but it was a very, very open and explicit book. But there's one line at the end that really, I think is very, very powerful. He says, you spend your whole life, gripping a baseball, and then you discover that it's really the other way around, right? That, that he thinks he's been holding the baseball the whole time, but really he's been gripped by the baseball. And what he's sort of talking about is like addiction, right? In other words, essentially, right? What is addiction, or you talk about somebody being an alcoholic or whatever it is you want to talk about. It's reaching a stage where something that you used to control now controls you, right? It's reaching this point where you're no longer in charge. And if we think about it in that sort of sense, so then, we're not necessarily, we might not be, alcoholics or drug addicts or whatever it is, but there is a sense that we really are slaves to some degree or another to something that controls us, right? There's a certain sense that we have, right? Sometimes even within our communities, but there's a certain sense that we have the sense of, we want to be something, we want to achieve something, we have the sense of who we really are, and yet we let all sorts of things control us, right? Other people's opinions, maybe our community's opinions, our family's opinions. It could be, for some people, it might be money, it might be whatever it is. But the first thing that I think is important to recognize is that it's true we don't have to go free from slavery of the kind that they went through in Egypt, but that we are all to some degree, to the degree that you allow anybody to rule over you, to cause you to do other than what you know to be correct and to who you are, it's a form of slavery. So I think, yeah.
Can we share personal stories?
If you'd like to, sure.
Okay, so last year I was unemployed and I was at home, And it was one of the second most miserable time in my life. And I figured out after contemplation that the reason is because I was, if you could say, addicted to feeling good about myself because of accomplishments. I had, been working hard in college and achieved success, and I was proud of myself. And it wasn't necessarily like other people's praise, but it was even my own opinion of myself, that I was proud of myself for having been successful. And then after a year of being unemployed, I just felt I was doing nothing with my life. Like I was, because I was being bored and not social, I felt disappointed. I felt like I was worthless because I wasn't doing anything, I wasn't achieving anything. And even though I was doing the best I could to try to, I realized like even like something that's a good thing, being successful, I was miserable when I wasn't able to do that.
Right, no, right. That's the thing. In other words, it could be something, and that's the way many addictions start off. In other words, it starts off with something that actually might even be of value, right? But eventually it reaches the point where even when it's no longer beneficial, that you sort of need to continue doing it. I mean, also just to share a story. I mean, so I teach in a middle school in the city, and I was actually talking about this idea a little bit with the kids, and one of the kids, is very, very bright, precocious, student. She says to me, she says, like, I hope this isn't inappropriate for me to ask, but is it only us who are slaves to things? What about you? Are you slaves to things? And if you feel comfortable, would you say what it is? And it was like, whoa, like I'm supposed to get you to think about stuff, and I gave an answer, and there was truth in it, but like, there was, of course, the stuff that I really, really was thinking, like, oh, this is what I'm a slave to, or I'm never going to say. But that's the truth. The truth is that we really do have this sense that there are things that that somehow enslave us, that somehow cause us to act in many ways against our best interests. So, one of the ideas that I think is important is that really we're not just like picturing like being slaves to paro and going free, but I think that really the goal on Pesach is to actually recognize that we can be free of some of these things, through a combination of effort and also the help of Hashem. I mean, it really does. I've never been there myself, but I've read enough about Alcoholics Anonymous that they talk about giving yourself over to a higher power. And part of it is this sense of, in order to be free, you need help sometimes to get out. I mean, that's the thing. Like on your own, it's very, very difficult to get out. So, so that's the first thing. There really is this sense of that we are slaves and that we need to go free. And just to build on that, I mean, I think this is important, to recognize like the Seder. That's it. When we talk about this being the goal of the Seder, to go from slavery to freedom, the entire Seder is set up with a goal of helping you achieve that. In other words, like it's sort of everything that we say, every word that we say, every food that we eat, every when we drink wine, when we have the meal, when we recline, everything is there. It's basically props, right? In other words, like we're trying to get into again, we're not trying to remember what happened to them. We're not trying to pretend. We're trying to experience. It's supposed to actually be this visceral experience, and the different foods and the things we drink and everything is supposed to kind of help us get there. So through this, again, that's the thing. We really do go, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more, from, you start off with the negative and you make it to the positive. So that's the first thing. I think there really is, I think if we're really going to get anywhere, it's the first to recognize that the idea of slavery is not so far from who we are. The second part, in terms of, slaves to slaves. So there's a Gemara that doesn't talk about this at all, but I'm convinced it's what it means. Maybe I'm right, maybe I'm wrong. It's a great thing about Agadata. You can say whatever you want. And it's sort of like art. You're just. But it's a Gemara in Maseches Avodah Zarah. I always like to teeter on the edge of heresy when I speak, so I'm not sure on which side. But there's a Gemara. It tells a story, and I'm not. So the one small bit of borderline heresy I'll say is I'm not sure if this story is meant to be taken literally or not. It doesn't really matter. In other words, I mean, whether it's literal or not. There's a message that's meant to be told here. So the Gemara tells us this story. It's kind of amusing, right? It starts off, it's talking about Unclos, right? Unclos, if you open up, typical Chumash inside, the first parish in history, right? People think it's a translation. It's really much more of a parish because he doesn't always stick to exactly what the words are saying. But, right, so Unclos was apparently, right? So the Gemara says that Unclos was the nephew of the Caesar. And that he was a convert, right? I mean, Unclos Hager. And it says that the Caesar was bothered by the fact that he had converted, and he decided he was going to basically kidnap Onkelos and bring him back. And he sends a group of soldiers to find him. And the Gemara just says, the first group of soldiers just says, Mashchinu Bakrai. He drew them in with psukim and told them something about Torah, be Gayer, and they converted. Okay, the whole group of soldiers, they converted, they don't go back. And of course, as these stories go, the Caesar doesn't learn his lesson, and he sends a second group of soldiers, but this time he's a little smarter, and he says, okay, I want you to go, but don't talk to him, about anything. Just don't get involved in one of these Torah discussions. So they go and they're taking him, and he says, can I at least talk to you about something that has nothing to do with Torah? Okay, fine. So he says, so let me ask you a question. He said, imagine you go to war, right? And and again, he uses all sorts of Greek or Roman or Latin terms. I have no idea what any of them really mean. I guess if you looked in art school, maybe they would tell you, but whatever. I'll just use modern idiom. He says, if you have the general, does the general go into war leading, holding the torch, the fire, with the lower soldier behind him, and does the court, I'm obviously not a military person, but what is it? Our colonel is next, I think, if I remember from MASH. Right, so so does he lead? Does it carry the fire for the colonel? Right, and does the colonel carry it for the major? And does the major carry it for the sergeant, and the sergeant for the captain, captain for the private? And they say, no, of course not. And he says, well, with us, God actually carried the torch for us. As it says, and he quotes the pasuk which talks about that Hashem led them in the desert with a fire, and they convert. Okay, and of course. All good stories have three parts. Once again, the Caesar does not learn his lesson, and he sends soldiers, and he says, "Don't forget it. No Torah, just don't talk to them." So as they're taking him out, he sees there's a mezuzah on the door, and he puts his hand by it, and he says, "Hey, what's this?" Right? And they say, "I don't know. You tell us." Right? And he says, "Well, usually, in the world of flesh and blood, in the human world, when there's a king." The king sits on the inside of the palace while he's surrounded by his guards who protect him. But in our world, right, it says, we're on the inside and God protects us, as it says, Hashem yishmor tzidkav v'oecha me'atav et olam. And they converted. And Caesar finally learns his lesson, and he didn't send soldiers anymore, and Onkelos got to stay. So it's an amusing story, right? But I have to assume that there's got to be some big idea going on here. They're not just like telling you a story about Onkelos, outsmarting his uncle, the Caesar, or something like that. There's got to be a lesson. So I'll tell you what I think it means to me. And again, I've never looked into Meforshim on this, but I think it's at least a possible reading. So the first time he talks about Torah, it's not really clear what to take from there. But if we look at the second part of it, right? If you've ever, either read about or seen even any sort of movie about what it was like to be a Roman soldier, you were basically cannon fodder. You were there in order to serve the Caesar, right? In other words, if there was a battle that they wanted to win, however many of you had to die, were going to die in order to win the battle, right? For the glory of the Caesar, for the glory of Rome, you yourself had no value, right? You could in theory rise up, and the higher you rose up, the more value you had. But as a soldier, you really were not that different from a slave, right? And he says to them, could you ever imagine your commanders honoring you? Can you imagine your commanders doing any, basically taking care of you? And they say, of course not, right? And but he says with us, it's not true. He says with us, God actually is the one who leads us. In other words, we're not there for God, but God is there for us. And there's something that's very powerful to this, because again, that's not the life of a slave or of a soldier, that your life is of value to the one who's taking care of you. In other words, slave master might take care of a slave, but he's doing it for the same reason you would take care of a car, or you would take care of your house or your horse or whatever, because if you take care of it, it's going to last longer. But there's not like any sense that you're there for them, they're not there for you. Right, and then we have the next part of the story, right? Again, with the mezuzah, that he's saying that, and again, he makes a similar sort of point. Again, the king sits on the inside, he's surrounded. The whole goal of everybody is to protect the king. He says, but again, God is here for us. God watches us. God, we don't need to, God doesn't need us to protect him. He's here to watch over us. And so what I think is really going on over here is that it's saying that, and it's almost like this is the difficulty with language in general, is that, we use words, in different contexts, and we think they mean the same thing, but they really very often don't, right? We talk about being slaves to God. We talk about being, even servants to God, right? And you say, well, so then the question makes sense, well, if we're just going from being from slaves to slaves, so what are we celebrating? But you see here, it really is, what I think this Gemara is suggesting is that everything we do as Jews, the entire system is there for our benefit. In other words, we're not there like slaves who are there for the benefit of the master, but it really is for our benefit. In other words, every aspect of what we do, every aspect of serving God is really about something like God giving us a benefit. So, but still, of course, it raises the question, if that's true, so then, why do we call it being a servant? And I'm going to come back to this, but I think that part of it is that sometimes, it's sort of like, those of us who are parents here are certainly, we've all, we've been on the receiving end of this as kids of parents, right? That sometimes, you say to your kid, I want you to do this, and the kid, not my kids, of course, and never me when I was a kid, but I've heard some people's kids, do this sometimes, where they'll say, like, why? Right, and the truth is that at your good moments as a parent, you actually have a meaningful reason for it, and not just because I said so. But at a certain point, right, maybe you're even like in an educational mood and say, well, let me tell you what my goal is. Let me tell you what I'm trying to do. And the kid goes, but I don't want to do it, right? And then finally you say as a parent, like, oh, I said do it, right? So I think that there's a certain aspect like that of that, in other words, that even if the mitzvahs are for us, there's some times where we might not appreciate it. In other words, we might not always be able to mine the meaning, within, or find the meaning within the mitzvah, right? In other words, Tamei mitzvah is a very, very big, important area, but might not always speak to us. So there is a certain aspect, right, where it says, like, even when it doesn't speak to you, you're like an Evan. God said so, right? So even if you don't personally see the gain that you're getting from it, that's really what that's really, there's some times where you have to just take it. I'm sorry? Yeah, sort of like, yeah, but I'm saying, but even to a certain degree, even a mishpat might come across as a chok sometimes. Something that might, and again, especially, the Rambam says that, sometimes people will say, like, a chok is just a law that has no reason. The Rambam says, God forbid that, God, well, he doesn't say God forbid, he's not the type to say God forbid, but, essentially, God forbid that God would, have purposeless mitzvahs. In other words, the chok just means that there's a purpose that we might not, we just don't necessarily know what it is. In other words, but there's something behind it. So, that's the thing. In other words, there might be moments that, like I said to my students, I said, what I do when it's time to daven, I'm not in the mood to daven. I daven, right? In other words, sometimes I daven because I want to speak to Hashem. Sometimes I daven because, and sometimes I daven because, the Shulchan Aruch says, or the Gemara says, or whatever you want to put it, says, you're supposed to daven. It's time for chakras. So, that's the sense that I think that there is a little bit of a sense of obvious that even if for some reason, right, usually if somebody says, well, I have something really good for you, you can say, I don't want it. But in this sense, we are commanded. So, although I'm going to come back a little bit, still to some of this slavery, idea a little bit later. And then finally, in terms of the third question, like, how are we thanking God for our freedom if he's the one who put us there, right? We know Bris ben Abisarim, Avram Avinu, Hashem says, Geri Zarecha, what is it, Ba'aretz Lolahem, I think? Right? And then they're going to oppress them, and they're going to be, so God put us there. So, like, what is the, that thing, imagine if, like, someone, comes over to you, they take a baseball bat, and they break your arm. And then, you're laying there on the floor, you're, like, in horrible pain, you're laying on the floor, you're crying, and they scoop you up so gently, and they say, don't worry, I'm going to take care of you, and I'm going to bring you to the hospital, and I'm going to make sure that you get the best treatment. And when you go out, I'm going to get you gifts, and I'm going to make sure you're really, really comfortable, right? You might say, if you saw that coming, you might say, like, it's okay, I don't need your kindness, right? And essentially, like, if you think about it, that's sort of like what's going on with Mitzrayim. God puts us into a situation where we're slaves, and where things are very, very difficult for us. I remember years ago, there was a movie, I think Steven Spielberg was behind it, I think unofficially behind the scenes, the OU was behind it, and it was supposed to be a telling of the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim, and a Hollywood production, but that was going to actually be faithful to the text. And everyone was very, very excited. It was an animated story, and right, I was teaching in the school at the time. They were so excited that took the entire, I don't know if it was the entire school or the entire middle school, I don't remember, but it took them to see the movie, and it was called The Prince of Egypt, and it was. It killed me. I hated it. I absolutely, because I mean, it was just like, I mean, I mean, in particular, the one part I remember, Aaron, Aaron, Cohen, Moshe's brother, I think the voice was done by Jeff Goldblum, who, whatever, but the whole, in the movie, he's this like goofy, big, stupid brother who's sort of like, and it's just like, I mean, I think, the idea that, that Aaron and Cohen being, to me, it was just absolutely awful. But there was actually one, right. There was one part of the movie that I thought was actually very powerful. When it came to showing the scene of like the Egyptians killing the Jewish babies, they did it in a way that it really, like, for the first time it hit me that they were Nazi-like. I mean, I know as Jews, like, we always connect everything to the Holocaust, but sometimes you actually can connect something, correctly to the Holocaust. But they were really Nazi-like. I mean, and it shows them coming in this very cruel way, smashing into houses, grabbing the babies, pushing the mother away. And, I mean, again, if you think about it, again, obviously in the final solution, there was all sorts of barbarism that couldn't have taken place back then. But still, I mean, the Holocaust essentially 6 plus years. I mean, some started a little bit earlier. The Jews were slaves in Egypt I mean, they were in Egypt for hundreds of years, but they were slaves for probably somewhere between 80 and 90 years. Eliyahu Kitov actually has this cool idea. He actually suggests it's 86. But however he gets there, if you want, afterwards, I can tell you, I think it's actually kind of a cool idea. But again, they were slaves in a, it wasn't just like, like a Disney version of like whistle while you work. I mean, they were slaves to these barbaric, people who were killing their children, who were beating them mercilessly. So in what sense do we feel a sense of, gratitude to God when He takes us out after He put us there? So, if I want, if we can come back to like the parable I gave before, that someone breaking your arm and then, helping you. Imagine it's a little bit different, right? I actually just saw this video. It was actually really wild. I mean, this little boy was born. His leg was actually crooked. The bone was crooked, and he was also born without fingers. And ultimately, they had to actually amputate the bottom of the leg. It wasn't growing properly, and they actually took one of the toes from his foot and put it onto his hand. It was actually like really, it was actually pretty powerful. But so imagine if someone's born with a bone that's deformed, and if it continues to grow in that manner, it's actually going to be harmful for them, right? So then, then. In order for it to be fixed, it first has to be broken, right? And if you saw just the doctor, breaking the kid's bone, you'd say like, that's barbaric. But if you recognize that it was actually that there was a necessity behind the breaking, so then not only the healing is important, but the breaking also is something. Yeah.
My sister broke her hand years ago, and they had to do that. They had to break it again.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's like, I remember when I was a kid. There was I think in Russia. Sounds like the kind of thing like the Russians would think of. There was this boy who was born like really, really short, and they figured out the way to make him tall. Was that they would actually break his leg in certain places and then not quite put the bones back together, and then somehow it would attach in a way that now he'd have like greater bone mass. And they did this a bunch of times. Again, it sounds like something like some doctor in like a Russian jail invented, and happened to discover that it was beneficial to people. But anyway, so I think that the basic idea is that somehow, and this is what I'm going to try to develop from this point forward, that somehow it's not just the going free that was for our benefit, but it's actually, and now we finally, after I don't know how long I've been speaking, we finally get to like the main idea of the shir is that even the part of it that seems negative is of value. So what do we do with all this? And how do we go about gaining freedom? So there's a saying I looked it up on Google, so now I know the source of it because it's on the internet, so it must be true. There's a saying that they talk about called bringing coal to Newcastle, right? It's apparently there's a place in England called Newcastle, and there used to be coal, and it was a way of like basically saying like that's so dumb. Like, why are you bringing coal to Newcastle? They already have it there. So like when you take an idea, when you mention something that you're coming to a place that they already have it, it sounds a little strange. So, it's weird, like I'm standing up here, I don't know what I am. I know Allison had the whole discussion of like, how, all the different labels, what do we call people? So I don't know if I'm unorthodox, if I'm centrist, if I'm right-wing unorthodox. I'm Hasidish maybe, right? Who knows? But right, that's true, right? But whatever I am, I'm not really certainly not, classically Hasidic. So it's interesting whether, some of you, actually, come from the Hasidic world. Some of you listening might come from the Hasidic world. So it's a little weird for me to, try to share Hasidus with you, except for the fact that, one thing that kind of strengthens me in doing this is that a lot of the Hasidim who I've met actually say that, one part that is not involved in being a Hasid is actually learning Hasidic thought. So it's left for, modern guys like me with, striped shirts and yarmulkes to learn the stuff that they should be teaching you. So I hope you'll, excuse me if I share some Hasidic thought, even though I don't come from that world. So, right, that's right. I'm actually, right, yeah.
Okay, let's put the usher will organize protest outside.
Right, that's right, God help us. So, sorry, I'm gonna park all my school buses in front of the building so that we won't see Usher.
Have signs in the trunk.
Along with the shovel and
It won't be the first time that I've been protested. But, so one thing that's been really, really interesting to me, as I've kind of I really have gotten very into like Hasidic thought recently, and one thing that's been really wild is that about 100 years ago, there was this sort of realization among a certain part of the Hasidic world that Hasidus had sort of veered off from what it was supposed to be. Right? In other words, the Hasidus of the Baal Shem Tov and the Maggid of Mezrich and all of the original disciples and disciples, which was this very creative and open, and there's not one derech, and there's not a way, but this real, passionate attempt to get, avodas Hashem. The Rebbe is this great tzaddik, and he helps bring you, to a closeness to God. There was a feeling of not only among outsiders, but among actual Hasidim that by the early 1900s, it had really, something had gone very, very wrong. Part of it was the complaint that, because being Rebbe was being passed on father to son, that, rather than being based on someone, the next generation who's the one who has the qualities to be Rebbe, was that, not all Rebbes were really such great tzaddikim, were such great leaders, were such great Talmidei Chachamim, and there was a sense that I'm sorry?
Can I comment?
Please.
A lot of the students I'm not sure about the Makom, but I know the Baal Shem Tov all became Rebbes, and they all had their own groups.
Right.
So it was like weird when I guess it started being father son.
Right. That thing, so at the beginning, it really was that thing, someone who would have the right kind of leadership personality and the right sort of ideas would just gather people to them, and who might even break off from one of the groups and say it really was like this tree, and it kept on breaking off, but all of a sudden you start going father to son, and it's like again, it doesn't always sometimes the apple falls very, very far from the tree, and the idea that automatically, just because of birth, you automatically fill that role, that was a problem. And again, it was just, and there were a lot of complaints that they were just, that you had to give them money, and that it was about uniform, again, certain things that are not that different from today. And what I've discovered was that, particularly in Warsaw, although other places as well, Rav Kook was somewhat like this, was you had these sort of, to some degree, even, the Piazetzner and the Rebbe, Glenn Makom and Shapiro would like this, was you had these sort of, not the big time groups. The big time groups, that's the thing, there was like this whole, it was just moving forward in a way that was very hard to actually pause and reflect. But some of these minor Rebbes and some of, they started saying, well, let's try to go back to real Hasidus. And what was really wild about some of them was that some of their ideas, we're going to see, were extremely, extremely radical, right? And not only that, you had Hasidic Rebbes who, believe it or not, were Zionists. You had Hasidic Rebbes who were studying secular philosophy, Nietzsche and Kant and all sorts of stuff like that. You had Rebbes who were studying Freud and were into Karl Marx and all sorts of stuff. Something again that if I'm sorry. You said something saying, in other words, most of them, most of them were actually, again, we're not necessarily like the big names, like the head of Ger, the head of Sommer, but I think you've seen me mention, he wasn't a Rebbe, but Hillel Zeitlin was one of these, he was, he was right, he read William James, who was an American existentialist, and he read his works in Russia, and he was trying to write a Jewish version of that, and again, wild stuff. Rav Kook quotes Nietzsche, and but again, some of it I found out from Baruch Miller. who sort of like is interested in these kind of people. But there's a professor in Israel also, Dr. Yonatan Meir, who was very into Zeitlin, and that's who I've gotten very into myself. And he gave this lecture in Israel, I think last week, this week, whenever it was. And he spoke about some other ones, and I just said to him, like, well, like you got me now. Now who do I read? And he told me about, there was a minor Hasidic Rebbe, I can't even remember what the group was. I'd never heard of them before. Rav Menachem Friedman. There are apparently 15 different Menachem Friedmans and Menachem Friedmans were Hasidic Rebbe. So it's not the Boyaner one, and it's not 2 or 3 or 4 other ones, but it was, again, this one, I never heard of him before. And again, you pick up, but I've been, of course, naturally, since I have so much money, I had to order a couple of his Svarim to start going through it, and then you start hearing about other people, and again, like it really is like really, really wild. And by the way, one of the things that's really, really interesting is, today as people are trying to figure out, how do you do theology in a day and age like ours, they actually discover that within these Hasidic Rebbe's, there's a lot of not just creative thought, but really like radical thought, stuff that, that if a guy, without mentioning any institutions or whatever, but like a guy in Riverdale said what some of these like Hasidic Rebbe's said, like they'd be like called a kofar. Not that anyone would do that, but right. So, just for example, probably in certain ways the most radical was Ishbitz. Ishbitz, what is it, May Shiloach, I think he wrote. And he was like a very, very, he was a very radical creative thinker. To a certain degree, he was, to use one of these like fancy terms, he was, antinomian. He was sort of like, he saw law, halakha, that's the halakha, during the day, that's the language I speak. He saw halakha as being, at best getting you towards a purpose, but sometimes getting in the way of the purpose. Again, he said a lot of stuff that was very, very radical. But again, he had a long beard, and he wore a shtreimel, and he had chassidim. So, in all seriousness, he also, he was, very shomer Torah mitzvahs. It wasn't like he was like, putting it into play and saying like, okay, we don't have to do this anymore. But he was very, very, he was a very, very radical thinker in certain ways, and he influenced a lot, a lot of different Rabbeim who came after him, and 2 of whom I just want to speak about a little bit now. One of them is Rav Tzadok HaKohen from Lublin, and the other one is Rav Kook. Again, like that's the interesting thing. That's one of the things I discovered. Like, to me, Rav Kook was always fascinating because he was a guy who was half Hasidish and half Misnagdish, classic, like at war with himself, and but came from, again, had a very Hasidish side. Did, definitely studied philosophy, whether in the original or translations or through however it was, but he definitely did, and he was a Zionist. And to me, like, it was like, wow, there's this one guy who's like this in the entire world. And so, but what I've discovered is that really, as you kind of look into this stuff more, you really had these other minor Hasidic Rebbe's who were sort of doing similar things. Unfortunately, they didn't, they and their Hasidim did not necessarily make it through World War II. Hillel Zeitlin was killed in the in the Warsaw Ghetto. Just a lot of them, like they and their ideas didn't make it that often outside. So therefore, someone like Rav Kook stands out because he was already in Israel, and his ideas therefore continued to be carried on by followers, or kind of, to whatever degree his son held on to it. But at least in theory, Rav Kook's ideas, continued. Whereas, like, if you were a minor Hasidic Rebbe and you didn't make it through the war, and your Hasidim didn't make it through the war, how much survived. So, so that's the thing. Like, in other words, like, one of the things that becomes interesting as you see this world is that, like, Rav Kook being a Zionist and a Chassid is not as strange as it sounds today. It's just, he's just the one that, people are more familiar with. But, so I just want to just share a couple of ideas, both from Rav Tzadok and Rav Kook, which I think really tie into what I'm trying to get to. And, just to, I guess, add one more thing, right? So there's different ways to get to who you're supposed to be as a Jew, right? I have a couple of, I have a number of friends who are into Musar, some of them like in a pretty serious way, 1 or 2 in a very, very serious way. But for a long time, Musar hasn't spoken to me. There's an aspect of Musar that is about, like, you have to change yourself. There's something bad about you, and you have to work on it, and you have to, break who you are, and you have to fix yourself. And and the truth is, there are some of those approaches within aspects of Hasidus too. I don't want to make it like it's like fully like the two, have nothing in common. But that approach, I don't know. In a lot of ways, I think is somewhat problematic, and I think it just doesn't ring true to me psychologically. The idea, like even the Rabbi Sol Salanter said, that to change one midah, it's harder to change one meter than to go through shots. Right now, I don't think he meant like Daf Yomi cycle. I think he meant like to like really go through shots. So like if changing one meter is going to be that difficult, then at least for me, I have more than one meter that needs to be changed. Like like how much do you really achieve with that? And what really speaks to me about a lot of Hasidic thought, and here's where I think we really could tie this in for Pesach about the idea of going free, is that freedom and even to some degree when we talk about tshuva as well, are not achieved by stopping being who you are, but there's a certain aspect that it's about actually being truer to who you are. In other words, again, like there's so many people in our lives. Everyone has it to some degree. Sometimes it's family who tells you, that who you are is wrong. You have to change this. You have to become like this. You have to be more like so and so. Or friends will tell I hope right. The second somebody says, I hope you don't mind my saying this. You know that you're going to mind them saying this, right? I really think you'd be happier if. Oh, what do you see in him? Why don't you, like people are always trying, they always think that the path to success and to happiness and to fulfillment and to freedom is about changing who you are. But there's a certain aspect of Hasidic thought that actually says very much the opposite. And you find it really both in, and again, and of course, like all, real good Hasidic thought, it was not made up in the 1700s. I mean, they took things that had always existed within Torah, but that had maybe not been as emphasized. I mean, I'm sorry? Yeah. So, like, for example, the idea that, in other words, like, that there's the Yetzer Hara, that the Yetzer Hara is something like outside of you, is very much, that's the way a lot of people think that it's something that's trying to get you to change, right? There's a famous story, I don't remember it exactly, I guess it's not that famous, but, that the Kutzker Rebbe, that they once, one of his Hasidim once said something to him about, like the Yetzer Hara, is making me, and he was talking about it as if it was outside of him, and the Kutzker Rebbe said, no, it's not there, it's there, right? It's inside of you. But again, the Yetzer Hara is not, it's not like in the, like I always say, like when you're a kid and you watch like cartoons, right? And the little boy is like going to do something, and like all of a sudden two angels pop up on their shoulder. There's the white angel who says, "Don't do it, Billy. You'll regret it. That's not who you are." And then there's like the red angel, is going, "Whoa, Billy, go ahead and do it. You'll be, that's, but the Yetzer Hara is not, it's not something outside of us. It's not some sort of, it's us. And same thing about the Yetzer Hara Tov. I mean, it's inherent to who we are. The Yetzer Hara is being physical, right? In other words, if we're basically, and you can see this a lot in Bereshit when it talks about when the world being created. If we really are half animal and half angel, or that we have those two parts, so then that is the Yetzer Hara and the Yetzer Hatov. In other words, our physical side, our animal side, the side that wants us to just do whatever we want without thinking about consequences. I mean, that's the Yetzer Hara. That's us. It's like. I always say like a lion, when they're about to eat a deer, doesn't think to themselves, but what about Bambi? I mean, Bambi's going to come home from school today and his mommy's not going to eat. You know what? Like, I think I'll have the salad. I'm sorry. Oh, you see, I haven't watched Disney movies in a long time. But whatever it is, I'm just saying, like, is that animals don't have anything but instinct. They do what they want without any real sense of consequences. And the Yetzer Tov is the part that gets you to think about the consequences of your actions, right? It's sort of, I always, tell my students about this. I don't know if you heard about this. They say the test that actually is the most indicative of success in life, it's the marshmallow test, right? The marshmallow test, you take a little kid, 4 or 5 years old, you bring him into a room and there's someone sitting behind the desk and there's a marshmallow on the desk and it says, I don't know why I always use the name Billy, but okay. But he says, Billy, do you like marshmallows? And he says, oh yeah, I like marshmallows. And he says, well, Billy, if you'd like, you can have this marshmallow, but I'm going to tell you what. I'm going to leave the room in a moment. The marshmallow's going to be right there, and you can take it anytime you want. But if you wait until I come back, you get 2 marshmallows. Okay? And some of the kids like, stick it in their mouth, and it's over. And some of them try like, I will not eat you, and then stick it in their mouth. And some kids figure out ways to distract themselves, close their eyes, nah, I do not hear you. And they actually wait, and they get the 2 marshmallows. And it's actually, that really is what pretty much all of life is about. making the better decision without just giving into what you want at that moment, right? I mean, it's basically, it's what Chazal say in Pirkei Avos, right? That you should weigh schar mitzvah keneged hefseda, schar avera keneged, keneged hefseda. It's just, essentially they're saying, there is a benefit in doing a sin, right? We don't sin, right? Unless you can get something from it. We don't sin, for altruistic. We do it because it does feel good. But what they're saying is that whatever benefit you're going to get, it's going to, cost you later on. Or whatever, there's difficulty in doing a mitzvah also, but whatever you're going to lose, you're going to gain more, right? I actually, I didn't do the marshmallow test when I was a kid, but there actually was a version of it. I didn't realize I was. But I was a little kid, I remember in day camp, and there was some woman who I guess was going for her master's or her PhD. Maybe she wanted to work with psychologically damaged children. So somehow she ended up, coming to work with me. And I remember she came and I only remember 2 questions. I assumed it was more than 2 questions, but it was a long, long time ago. But she said, if you could have a magic marker tomorrow or a pack next week, which one would you take?
What?
One magic marker or a whole pack of magic markers next week, right? Magic marker, right? And she said, if you could have a quarter tomorrow or $1 next week, which one would you take? A quarter tomorrow. And I assume I did that with all the things. It was just theoretical. I remember the next day, I still remember this. I remember walking, there was a knock at the door and there she was. And I remember I stepped out onto the porch and she handed me a quarter and she handed me a marker and I just wanted to punch a wall. I was just I was so it hit me hey dummy, if you've just been a little patient. And that really is, that's something that's Yetzer Hara, Yetzer Tov. The part of you that says just breathe, you're going to be happier if you wait. But that's inside of us. It's not something outside of us that's trying to get us to change. And the truth is, you look. We tend to think of the Yetzer Hara as being. Chazal make that it says when it says at the end of the first parak of in parak Aleph in Bereshis, when it says Vayarel can be named Tov Ma'od the Yetzer Hara, right? That the Yetzer Hara is actually is a good thing, right? I think it might have been maybe I think it was the Rav Ashlag maybe who wrote the Sulam. I think that's where I saw this. That it gives a whole mashal of a king who wants to see who wants to test his son and see if he's going to listen, and he gets this woman he tells his son don't ever go with a certain type of woman, and then gets this woman to try to entice the son, and then and again if the son passes, he actually it's given him something great. And in the mashal it says you would think, well, what about the woman? She's bad, right? No, she is actually the reason that the son was actually able to be successful. That the Yetzer Hara, that in other words, making use of the Yetzer Hara is actually a positive thing, right? Or towards the end of Mesechus Brachos, it talks about it says in Shema B'chol Levavcha, right? It goes through and each step B'chol Levavcha, B'chol Nafscha, B'chol Meodecha, right? And it goes through each step. What does it mean? It says, what is Levavcha, right? Why doesn't it say Libcha with all your heart? Why Levavcha with all your heart? It says in Shnei Levavcha, right? Your Yetzer Hara, Yetzer Tov. Again, the Yetzer Hara is not something to be defeated. It's not something that you're supposed to get rid of. It's something bad that you have to change, but it's you, and you have to figure out how to incorporate it. So that and in fact, Rav Tzadok actually says, it's in connection to tshuva, but to some degree, I really do feel like Pesach night is a different type of not a tshuva opportunity, but the same way you would around the Yom Noraim, you try to find something to work on that you want to do better in. Same thing, I think Pesach to a certain degree really, if we take that original idea that we're all slaves, that Pesach is about taking one aspect of something that we're slaves to and trying to break away from it. So it is almost well, again, not so much to get away from it, but again, what Tzadok says. And it says this in Sitkas HaTzadik. I didn't bring it inside, have the full quote. It's in my car. But again, he talks about this idea that of recognizing that even your sins can only happen through the ratzon of Hashem. If Hashem really is the life force of the entire universe, it's not just the good stuff that comes from Him, right? You might even say there's no, sitra achra as some might say. It's that God's the life force of everything. So in other words, if you're doing a sin, even the recognition, he says tshuva is the recognition that even that sin is part of Ratzon Hashem, is part of God desires it, as strange as that sounds. But again, but this idea that Rav Tzadok is sharing, I think, is very, very powerful. That again, rather than seeing, yourself as being, like this very like Christian idea of like, being a sinner and you have to cast it out and you're sinful. But he's saying that no, that who you are, you have to learn to appreciate who you are. It's a recognition of accepting who you are, of not seeing who you are as something bad that has to change, but of realizing that to a certain degree that who you are is exactly who God wants you to be. And that, that you're, to serve God is not to remove who you are, but is to take exactly who you are and put it towards that. And Rav Kook, and this will be the last part, I picked up this Rav Kook Haggadah, which is put out by someone who, I don't know if I would have the arrogance to say that he's a friend, but he's certainly someone who's a mentor. He's someone who I've gone to a shiurim. This is Rav Bitzal in the Or, who's probably, he's not the biggest expert in the world in Rav Kook. He's certainly up there. So he put out a Rav Kook Haggadah. He collected a lot of different sources. It's absolutely fantastic. There's one idea in there that really, really hit me, right? So in the Gemara Maseches Pesachim, right? So I said, remember, the whole Pesach Seder is there to help us get from slavery to freedom. And it really is. It's like a play that we're acting on. You've got all these props. And in the Gemara Pesachim, it says, very famous statement, Masil B'Gnosu M'Sayim B'Shvach, or Sheva, right? You start off with the negative, and then you speak about the positive, right? And so what's the negative? So there's two parts, and when, of course, we incorporate both of them in, right? One of them is that, Arami Oved Avi, that originally we were, our ancestors, before Abraham came about, our ancestors were idolaters. We came from a world of idolatry, right? And the other side of it is, Avadim Hayinu. The negative, according to another opinion, is that we were slaves. You start off talking about being slaves, and then at the end, you talk about, and then you move away from that. So Rav Kook, asked an interesting question. He says, like, well, why is it that we're talking about, what's the goal of talking about these things? I mean, why is it that we're talking about worshiping Avodah Zarah, that we come from those who worship the Avodah Zarah, and why is it we talk about, coming from slavery? So he says something that's really, really wild, right? And it's not the only place where he says this. But he says that not only did we gain something by stopping worshiping Avodah Zarah, but we actually gained something from having, Avodah Zarah DNA in our bodies. I mean, he doesn't use that term, but essentially that's what he means, right? He somewhat famously, I believe he uses this by the Akedah, right? When Abraham is told he's supposed to bring Yitzchak, he's supposed to sacrifice him, and and like at the last minute God steps in. And it's like it's a little bit of like a strange story. Why is God asking to do it if he doesn't want to do it? So Rav Kook had this idea, and I think it comes from here. I mean, I think it really has to come from here. It's the same type of idea that he says that, and this is a big Rav Kook idea also, that there's nothing in the world that exists. Again, it's like a similar, like we're saying with Rav Tzadok, if God is really the life force of the entire universe, then nothing in the universe exists that is against the will of God. So, so again, Rav Kook found, every group that everybody, everybody, thought was terrible. He found something in the secular Zionists, and he found things in the kids who were being Machal Shabbos. Rav Kook, everything was a step towards Mashiach for Rav Kook. He actually did take from the world. Well, all right. I'm in this building. I'll be careful. I won't say. Anyway, no. We'll scratch that from the tape, of course. So Rav Kook says something very powerful. He says that, so what's the value in Avodah Zarah? He says, you think it's like completely awful, this idea that, you have to somehow bribe God, and you have to be willing to, the more you're willing to give up, the greater it is, and, you're a greater, greater chance you're going to get Zeus or whoever to do what you want, right? So therefore, what's the highest form? Being willing to sacrifice a child, right? I'm giving up the most precious thing for me, God, in order that you be good to me, right? So, on the one hand, that's like a pretty evil thought, right? Sacrificing your children for your own gain, although it maybe sounds like a mushal for some people these days. I didn't say that. Anyway, I keep on digressing. I'm sorry. But he says, but so the idea of it actually acting on it is evil, but a willingness to do whatever it takes to connect to God is actually very powerful, right? So he says by the Akedah that what God wanted Abraham to be willing to act like an idolater, but without the immoral ending to it of actually carrying it through, right? And so he says like a similar thing over here. He says, in other words, there's something in idolatry, and again, like that's something like Rav Kook finds Rav Kook finds meaning in, you know, in certain, you know, Christian philosophers. I mean, there's always something in there that he feels that's gained. He says, you know, idolaters have this great imaginative faculty. I mean, this is an idea that goes back for a long time. I mean, the idea that imagination is part of nevuah. I mean, Rambam talks about this. I mean, it's always, you know, we think of imagination as being like a little kid's thing, you know, that you play games, but really a lot of it, I mean, you know, when we daven, we're supposed to be, you know, see ourselves as Omed Lifnei Makom. You know, there is this sense that of being able to really picture yourself in certain situations. And the truth is, even, you know, I mean, you know, at a certain point when I realized that, you know, I was 5'6" and couldn't jump, and I was not actually going to be able to actually be a basketball player, you know, one of the things I considered was that I wanted to maybe be a sports psychologist, right? You know, so, you know, and the truth is, you know, because I'm saying, because there's more to being an athlete than just the physical side of things, right? You know, I mean, it's not a bad thing to be born 7 feet tall and to be able to dunk, but on the other hand, there are moments where, you know, you're standing in a basketball arena, 25,000 people standing on the line, you know, shooting foul shots, and, you know, there are a couple of like crazy people behind the basket who are standing there and dancing and trying to distract you, and everybody's booing. And at that moment, even though you've taken thousands of foul shots in your life, it's not so easy. Not because you can't do the motion, but because your head is like, you know, you're trying to quiet it down, you're trying to ignore it, and that's when you get. So they're actually like, they're psychologists who actually work with athletes to kind of help them get through the mental aspects of the game. And again, like, you know, they talk about one of the skills that, you know, I remember reading about this. You know, one of the skills they teach you about is you know, picturing it in your mind, you're shooting it and going in. That it actually makes it much more, you know, likely to be successful, right? I mean, I don't, you know, again, I haven't used it in a sports venue, but when one of my little kids actually asked me to unbutton like shirts, and I don't know how somehow like little kids, like especially like their arm buttons, they get them in a ridiculously tight position where you can't unbutton it. And I know, like, sometimes, like, before I do it, I'll be like, you're going to open it, picture it going through, it's going to go through. And, you know, I mean, I've never missed a shot, so it does work. So, you know, I'm saying imagination actually is like it's a very big deal. And so Rav Kook says that the idolatrous world, with all of its fantasy and all of its, you know, all the stuff that seems maybe a little crazy to us, actually, again, there was you know, if we had just started off as monotheists, if we did not have that idolatrous DNA, we wouldn't be able to use, you know, our imagination in a positive way within religion. And then the second side of it is, he says also, well, so what about being slaves? Like, what is positive about being slaves? So one of the things he says is that you learn to be submissive, right? In other words, and you know, hi guys, you know, right, lady. Let's walk in quietly. How you doing, Rabbi? Sorry. Right, we're sorry. Lady, just sit for a minute. I'm almost done. Anyway, I'm sorry. So you know, in terms of, you know, so what's the value of being a slave? So Rav Kook says something very interesting. He says, like, the willingness to be submissive, right? I mean, I mentioned before, I don't know, you know, it's hard to say. I mean, I was just involved in this whole Facebook discussion about this. It's not always so clear where Rav Kook is getting his sources from. I mean, he read a massive amount. Again, he was influenced by the Ramchal and yes, from Chabad and from Rav Tzadok, but he also was reading, you know, in various, you know, and one of the things that a lot of these Hasidic thinkers of the early 20th century, you know, were commenting on, were trying to make use of, was Nietzsche's idea of, like, Nietzsche spoke about the will to power, that all of existence is about trying to, you know, dominate. And maybe to some degree, I mean, this is just a guess, but maybe to some degree, Rav Kook was saying that if, you know, I mean, that there's a very destructive force if all you want to do is dominate, that there's a value in sometimes being able to submit, to being able to give in, learning to sometimes, you know, be an eved. And, you know, and that connects to, you know, what I was saying before in terms of, you know, that if the purpose, you know, like, if there are mitzvos, if the purpose of the mitzvos, you know, are for our benefit, but there are moments where we don't feel like it. There are moments where it doesn't seem to make sense. There's a certain, you know, there are just moments where it doesn't speak to me. There are times where and I remember a friend of mine, you know, once told me he grew up Sommer. If I mentioned the name, you know who it was, but I'm not sure if I'm allowed to mention the name. But a friend of mine grew up Sommer, and he said that there was a certain Sommer rabbi that he knew, and he would sometimes watch him daven. And he said sometimes he would take 20 minutes for Shemona Esrei, and sometimes it would take 2 minutes. And, finally one day, like he went over and he said, Yolandenu Rabbeinu, Torah, what's going on, right? Because most people in the world are either the 20-minute daveners or they're the 2-minute daveners. There's not too many people who are both. And he said something very interesting. He said sometimes I just want to speak to God and I just want it to go on for as long as possible. And sometimes I could barely stand them and I just want it to be over. And we all have those moments. That's the thing. In other words, like I think one of these things is that we sometimes, one thing that I absolutely hate, I don't know if you see these, but on Facebook they have these memes like 6 things happy people do. Like just do this and you'll be happy, right? All you have to do is go, and it's so stupid and it's so simplistic, which is really shocking on Facebook because so much of it is so deep. But it's the idea is if it just makes it seem as if there's no such thing called depression, and if you would just practice smiling more, it's not true. In other words, there's dark parts to our personality, and again, we sometimes think that we're not supposed to show that part, right? We think that we have to always put on a happy face, that there's some sort of value is coming across as always happy, right? I mentioned before that someone showed me this article where it seems that one of the Lubavitcher Rebbes, the Rebbe Rashab, went to see Freud, and it seems that he might have struggled to some degree with depression, right? And again, apparently some of the articles that were written about why he was going, apparently it was really gross and inappropriate, and it's not really true. But there seemed to be some pushback before when we were discussing this, the idea that you could have a Hasidic Rebbe who would struggle with depression or anxiety. As if, again, somehow being a tzaddik means, just always being in the right state of mind. And, but we're not. And I think that that's the thing. In other words, I think that, that we think that, you have to serve God, to really be a true Oved Hashem, to be a good Jew, you have to always be in the right mood, you have to be in the mood, but we might have a trait like anger, and we might have a trait like, frustration or disappointment or sadness or all those things. And rather than hiding it, that you can serve God with all of those things, right? And Rav Kook is saying, at those moments, I think what you can take from here is the idea that, sometimes we serve God just like an Eved. Sometimes we do it because, we learn through being slaves in Mitzrayim that, sometimes you just, we follow not because we want to, not because we're in the mood to, not because we're happy, not because it really means anything, but because it's a mitzvah, it's a commandment, that God said so. So just to, wrap up, I really think, there's different approaches that work at different times, and I think there was a time in my life, I remember, the Madrigas Adam, which was written by, by the author of Navardik, and, there's all these jokes about Navardik, about, I'm garnished, all these, but it was actually, I remember there's a certain point in my life where I was this close, sort of I knew that if I spent 5 more minutes, really trying to get into this, I was going to just devote my entire life to it, and then I couldn't quite do it. It really spoke to me. I remember I still own the Sefer. And I took it off the shelf a couple of weeks ago, and I started looking at it, and it's interesting ideas, but it doesn't speak to me at all. And I think that that's what I was saying before. I think there was a day and age for Musar. I think there was a day and age where people could take the idea that there's a certain part of you, and you have to wrestle with yourself and overcome it, and you're going to mold yourself into something different. But I think these ideas of Hasidus, found in Reb Tzadok and Reb Kook, and really, Balatanya as well, these ideas that who we are as people is fully within Ratzon Hashem, is fully that Hashem gave us not only all of our traits that people like, but even the traits that people might not be so happy with, and that every aspect of who we are can be used and should be used in our connecting to Hashem. So I would just say, as we head into Pesach, if we really want to try to experience, as I said before, not just, that they were slaves and they went free, and not just that we're pretending to be slaves in Egypt, but if we really want to break free of all the things that enslave us. And again, I think, look, I can't ignore the fact that I'm speaking at Project Makom. I think there are so many people, who I've met with in Project Makom who, again, so many aspects of their life are, they're not willingly slaves, but there's so many, there's, all sorts of, jobs you can't do, and there's all sorts of people you can't spend time with, and if you do this, it's going to ruin your shidduchim, and there's this whole sense, and there's this whole sense of, all these things that we're enslaved to, and, that we don't want to be, and I think the first step to breaking free from it is what Reb Tzadok and Reb Kook are telling us here. This idea that yes, there's going to sometimes be these outside forces, but I think the first step for us Tzadok says with tshuva, but I think it's very true for any type of freedom. The first step for us is to learn to embrace who we are, to recognize that who we are is not bad in the eyes of Hashem, that even when we have anger, even when we have sadness, even when we, depression, even when we sin, right, as Rabbi Tzadok says, that all of that is still, within the world of Ratzon Hashem, and that, who we are is who we need to be in order to get to being, the best Jew possible. And if we really try to take this into, in this Pesach, then I think that really we can, personally, in a very real and deep, meaningful way, experience what it's like to go from slavery to freedom.
Whoa, very good.
I don't know if anyone questions, comments on anything.
Sharing personal experiences.
No, I guess one thing I definitely want to watch it about being a slave. I think the problem is not really being a slave per se, it's the matrix that we're living in a huge community, for example, like, and you're like, because if you do this, or for example, if you go to the movie theater, you're a goy, you're a shaggy, you're a goy, you're a shaggy, you're a goy, you're a shaggy, you're a goy. I mean, we have to know that it's nothing to do with them, it should do with Hashem. Hashem decides this person married this person, this person married that person. Doesn't matter if you go to a movie theater, if you go to a gym, if you go to a who knows what, nobody cares. I think it's all BS. I think the fact that I think what you're saying, they have to express and be yourself. This is who I am. I think this is going to help that person get a much better shadda, because I think the growth of boy will realize, hey, this person is really true who they are. And I'm not saying I'm a labeled boy. I'm learning. And I'm doing stuff, and I'm going to schmuck and in the store.
I think there's something very, very true to that. In other words, I think if we look at marriage as the attempt to find someone who, loves us for who we are, then they can only love us for who we are if they're able to see who we are. And if, in other words, if we're living within our community for, within our community's values of telling us what it is, and we're pretending to be that. So then, that's the thing. We're not going to find someone who's right for us, but people are being set up with they're only right for the pretend us. So I think that's like a very, certainly I think that's a very, very big idea. And I just think that, again, the idea of Pesach is again, not in a destructive way, saying I don't care what anybody thinks anymore. I'm just going to speak my mind. Hey, I'm going to cut people off in traffic. But in other words, in a strong inner sense, a sense of confidence in who you are, a sense of, again, I always say v'ahavta re'echa kamocha. There's no, you can't love another person if you don't first love yourself. There's no, there's no kamocha unless you love yourself. And I think that's the thing. And again, not loving the self that you think you should be or the self that other people, but willing to look at yourself very deeply. And again, not lying to yourself and pretending that you're perfect, but saying that whatever ways that I'm not, the ideal whatever that somebody thinks I should be. Oh, so many comments, Andrew. But, right, all right. No. We're never going to get this place again if this goes. Anyway. All right. I just want to say that not all of the things that appear on this video reflect the views or opinions of this speaker or this shul or this radio station. No, but seriously, I think that really reaching a point of I have a friend of mine, a very good friend of mine, who a bunch of years ago I met, told me this saying of wearing your freak, being willing to be, in other words, I spend my time all day with middle school kids, and middle school, again, that's the age psychologically where it's all about you start to break away from your parents and you start to figure out who you are, and that's why these groups it's so much who didn't sit with you at the table in this one, and look and you're wearing the wrong color shirt, and mom, I'm never gonna but to a certain degree if we don't work on that, you spend your whole life trying to please other people, trying to dress the right way and trying to speak the right way and trying to be in the right yeshivas and trying to get the right and you wake up one day and again there's no greater obvious than that. There's no greater sense of being a slave in that and that is that you have no control over yourself. That's what a slave is. A slave has somebody else who makes their decisions, right? It's to the point. They've even shown that slaves. Even we don't think about it because in the Western world, you don't really have it. But in parts of the world, in third world countries, there are still slaves, and they've actually found these organizations that are involved in trying to free them. They find that often within a few days of being set free, that they go back to their masters and want to because they can't handle it. In other words, it's much more difficult to have to. Right. Shawshank Redemption, right? When the guy goes free after having been in jail for all those years, and the world is just too hard for him, and he wants to go back. In other words, there's a certain But I'm saying, but there's a certain comfort in having somebody make decisions for you.
Not necessarily true.
Well, again, not for everyone, but I'm saying, but there's a certain aspect when, again, I think I've shown, like, in terms of what I think is real chassidus, I very much believe in that. Well, one thing, but I think the idea that, that whenever there's a tough decision, you go to somebody else and you say, well, should I do this? And they tell you and you walk away, there's a certain comfort in that. There's a certain comfort in, well, I was told it by somebody who's closer than God. I don't have to think about it. I don't have to struggle. There's a certain comfort in that. But again, making your own decisions, even when it's painful, even when you don't know how it's going to turn out, I mean, that is the definition of being a free person. Yeah.
You have a strong point, but I have one thing, the last thing I got to disagree with you. I mean, I was born into it when we have a difficulty or something we're going through. I mean, I would ask if I had a rabbi, I said, listen, rabbi, this is the shit, should I go forward, or should I bracha from the Rabbi and I should be successful? I think it's a normal thing. I think the fact that you did the hashkadlos, the person has to do the shot. Once you have a finished product, once you get the finished thing, I think that's when it's best to ask the Rabbi or someone higher. I think because.
Right now, so I don't think we're disagreeing. In other words, I'm not saying that, I mean, Aseh Lecha Rav, I think is a very, very major concept, although I don't think it necessarily always means what people think it means. But in other words, having someone to bounce ideas off, I think it says, in imperfections, it actually says Aseh Lecha Rav twice. So Rashi just says, like, okay, yeah, two rabbis thought Aseh Lecha Rav is important, but Rabbi Yonah actually says that there's two aspects to Aseh Lecha Rav. One is you should have a post-it, someone who answers your halachic Shabbos. So that's not that hard to find someone. But he said the second one is someone who is outside of you, who can give you advice. And if you look, it's very interesting because it says, Aseh Lecha Rav, it says even if they're not a greater Talmud Chacham than you, even if they know less than you, right? Even if they're not a rabbi, what do you mean Aseh Lecha Rav? Because again, the purpose there is not to have someone who's, but it's to bounce ideas off, because we're all inherently biased towards ourselves, right? We always, I mean, our brain is designed, I mean, they've shown this, like, our brain is designed to make the decisions that make us feel good, not what's necessarily the right thing. So, there certainly is value in bouncing things off the other person. But again, there's a difference. There's two different ways of, like, going to a Rebbe. There's I want to speak things out. This is what I think. Can you give me a bracha? Versus, tell me what to do. In other words, going for, a bracha, like, after you've made a decision or speak out both sides is very, very important. That's Aseh Lecha Rav. But
that's normal.
Right, no, 100%. But I'm saying, but the next step, the step of, should I, do X or should I do Y? And whatever you tell me, you don't even have to tell me the reasons. Just, I'm going to do it. That is not really, that's not really freedom. Yeah.
It works like that with abuse, like when someone's in an abusive relationship, so they're being controlled sort of. So when it's like you see that pattern, I mean, when people are helping codependents, like it's kind of the same idea. Like they revert back to that, like they have to get, everything improved and everything,
Right. No. It's one of the things that's, like, I find so fascinating psychologically is that we'd rather be comfortably unhappy or in a terrible situation than be uncomfortably free. There's something about, like as a teacher, I mean, I always see that, like, a kid would rather be seen as, like, the annoying kid who, like, always bothers everybody and always, like, than try to be someone else. And, they already know me, like, I have a role here. I'm the annoying guy who always bothers everyone, and again, and as much as you say to yourself, like, what an awful role, everyone's gonna know what, no, but, I have my place here, and that willingness, that willingness to be willing to say, like, to break away and to say, it takes a lot of time, but I think that really is, I think in such a major way, I think that if we, learn to be comfortable with who we are, that we learn that really in the end of the day, that we're most responsible for ourselves, that really, who we are is between us, and God, and that we don't really have to, even look, I mean, it's a difficult situation. Obviously, we want to have as much, when it's possible, we want to have a very positive relationship with our parents. There's Hakaras Hatov. But it's all, yeah, I mean, it's sometimes there's a recognition that even, the people who brought you into the world right now are not, are harmful to who you are as a person. And that I mean, sometimes you have to break away, I mean, and maybe later on it could be healed, but the first step is to, be in a place where you're healthy, where you're able to, where you're not being controlled, where you're not being manipulated, where you're not being hurt. I mean, that's really, that's what it is. And again, that's something that's, like, so fascinating, is that people sometimes, they get used to being hurt. That's sort of, I know what my role is. I know what's going to happen. I know what's going to happen when I get home. Freedom is, again, it's sort of, it's scary. It's, it's sort of, it's much more difficult to have to make decisions. Yeah.
I was actually reading on Facebook. Someone posted on Facebook about, that. I think it was Purim time that, they're always going to go back to their parents, they know the parents are going to hurt them, and they're like always doing, they know the parents are going to hurt them and people were big time, but they're always going to go back to their parents because they don't know anything else. They still think in their mind their parents are there for them. And
yeah, look, I mean, one of the things I find, it's very interesting, they say that, to some degree, your relationship with your parents very much influences, how you see God, which is, I've seen that in my own life. I mean, it's a very, it's a complicated thing. It's a very, in other words, our parents are our first heroes. They're the ones who are supposed to, and usually do help us when we can't help ourselves. And it's a natural instinct for a child to want to be happy with their parents. And sometimes that means that even, when they hit me, look, that's what it takes to have a relationship. I think, what's his name, Dr. Pelkovich, Ralph Pelkovich, he said something really, really interesting. He said that they,
when did Ralph happen?
Doctor, Ralph, I don't know, what's his Hebrew name that he goes by when he speaks to, from our audiences? What is he, Rafa? Whatever it is. Okay, yeah. No.
I know the RCA is just a big deal, but I'm not calling someone who isn't Ralph.
No, Ralph. I think his name. I think his first name is Ralph. Yeah. No. I don't even deserve my own space. I can't give it to other people. But
you deserve me.
Maybe when I pass away, I want you to be the melech, for me in front of Hashem. Just, you see a lot of things in me that I don't. But
Rabbi, you would want to wrote a beautiful
look at this. Hashem, I hope you're taking notes.
And look, can you swear? The Rabbi
Right. No. So anyway, so he took. All right, the world knows. Don't worry, they hear you.
He's got the device, yeah.
Right. But he told the story about these. This father was an alcoholic, and he had these twin sons, identical twins, and one of them ended up being an alcoholic, and one of them ended up totally not. And they spoke to them, and they said, what is it that got you to be who you are? And the one who was not, who didn't drink at all said, I looked at my father and I said, the only way that I'm going to be close to him is if I don't end up, copying who he is, if I'm someone who could have a relationship with him, if I'm whole for myself, that's what's going to be. And said the other one, and why do you end up being an alcoholic? Because I saw how much my father loved alcohol, and I realized that the only way I was going to get close to him was if I was going to, drink as much as he did. And that's the thing. Like in the end of the day, there is this aspect where sometimes having a predictable negative role feels good. Again, you're right. That's we sit and we get drunk, smashed out of our minds together. Together we pass out, when we can't handle alcohol anymore. But I'm saying, but that's the thing. Like, it's true. And again, it's complicated both, from a psychological perspective, a halachic perspective. Although I don't think it's as complicated as people think. I think sometimes, if you're in a relationship that's harmful to you, either psychologically or physically, you have to get away. It's not even that you're allowed to. I mean, that you have to. I think that sometimes people have this very confusing idea that somehow that no matter what the parents do, they have to, it's a sin to not, again, it doesn't mean necessarily, you go and you beat them up or anything like that. But again, just sometimes, sometimes you have to not be, you have to not be around them. Right? However, okay. So anyway, Chag Kasher Sameach, Gigantiv, I don't know, whatever other nice salutations. But thank you for those of you who came out in person. Thank you for those of you who maybe stuck through this whole interesting experience. And yeah, all right.